welcome to Hare the Rabbit podcast. We explore everything that is rabbit. We look at different rabbit breeds, history, superstition, pop culture, news, and more. I would like to thank you for joining me today, your host, Jeff Hittinger. I'm not an expert, I'm just curious about learning more about rabbits, just like you. Welcome to 2018. This is the start of the second year for the podcast. As a recap from last year, we put out 44 episodes. That's almost an episode a week. We had 2 interviews, one with a Japanese exchange student, Yudai Tanabe, and one with Susie at Laughing Orange Studios. We covered about 23 different rabbit breeds and 3 hares. So it looks like every other episode is about a specific breed. My favorite 3 episodes from last year were the Space Rabbit episode, the Jackalope, and Halloween Rabbits. What was your favorite episode? Post it in the comments for the show. Now, our item of the week is the Peter Rabbit book, the authorized edition from Warren Publishers, and you'll find a link to this in the show notes. I would like to thank those that purchased through the Amazon to support the show. Looks like we had a purchase of Frog Lube, Frog Tube 5-piece kit, an LGX charge case, Blade Tactical 3-in-1 survival tool, an LGX charge case slide-out wallet pouch, and a USB rechargeable plasma lighter, flameless butane free. Now, it's easy to support the podcast and won't cost you anything extra. You just go to the hareoftherabbit.com, and there's a link right there to take you to Amazon, and would definitely appreciate the support. Amazon has not seen enough qualified sales activity on the account and will discontinue the account after about 90 days. So if you can click on that link and support us through your purchases, that would be terrific. Thank you. And on with today's episode, we're going to check out Peter Rabbit. I would like to give special thanks to my wife on this episode for being the voice of Beatrix Potter. Peter Rabbit is a fictional animal character in various children's stories by Beatrix Potter. He first appeared in the tales of Peter Rabbit in 1902 and subsequently in 5 more books between 1904 and 1912. Spin-off merchandise includes dishes, wallpaper, and dolls. He appears as a character in a number of adaptations. The rabbits in Potter stories are anthropomorphic, and they wear human clothes. Peter wears a jacket and shoes. Peter, his widowed mother, Miss Josephine Rabbit, as well as his sisters, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, live in a rabbit hole that has a human kitchen, human furniture, as well as a shop where Josephine sells various items. Peter's relatives are cousin Benjamin Bunny and Benjamin's father, Mr. Bouncer Bunny. Helen Beatrix Potter, known as Beatrix, was born on the 28th of July, 1866, to Rupert and Helen Potter in Kensington, London, and she is one of the most beloved children's authors of all time. She was the daughter of Rupert and Helen Potter, both of whom had artistic interests. Her father trained as a lawyer, but he never actually practiced. Instead, he devoted himself to photography and art. Her mother, Helen, was skilled in embroidery and watercolors. Beatrix got to know several influential artists and writers through her parents, including painter John Everett Milius. Her younger brother, Walter Bertram, was born 6 years after her birth. Both Beatrix and Bertram loved to draw and paint, and often made sketches of their many pets, including rabbits, mice, frogs, lizards, snakes, and a bat. Beatrix was always encouraged to draw, and she spent many hours making intricate sketches of animals and plants, revealing an early fascination for the natural world that would continue throughout her life. Although she never went to school, Beatrix was an intelligent and industrious student, and her parents employed an art teacher, Miss Cameroon, and a number of governesses, including Annie Moore, to whom she remained close throughout her life. 2 of Beatrix's earliest artist models were her pet rabbits. Her first rabbit was Benjamin Bouncer, who enjoyed buttered toast and joined the Potter family on holiday in Scotland, where he went for walks on a lead. Benjamin was followed by Peter Piper, who had a talent for performing tricks, and he accompanied Beatrix everywhere. The most exciting time of the year for Beatrix was the summer, and that's when her family traveled north to spend 3 months in Scotland. The children had the freedom to explore the countryside, and Beatrix learned to observe plants and insects with an artist's eye for detail. When she was 16, the family stayed instead at Ray Castle, looking over Lake Windermere, where Beatrix began a lifelong love of the countryside and of the Lake District. Beatrix as a botanist, artist, and storyteller. Beatrix was invited to study fungi at the Royal Botanical Garden in Kew. She produced hundreds of detailed botanical drawings and investigated their cultivation and growth. Encouraged by Charles Mackintosh, a revered Scottish naturalist, to make her fungi drawings more technically accurate, Beatrix not only produced beautiful watercolors, but also became an adept scientific illustrator. By 1896, she had developed her own theory of how fungi spores reproduced and wrote a paper on the germination of spores of Agricea, which was initially rejected by William Thistleton Dyer, director of the Royal Botanical Gardens. Undeterred, Beatrix continued her research, and after a year, George Massey, a fungi expert who worked on the Kew Gardens, agreed to present her paper to the Linnean Society of London, as women at the time were not permitted to do so. Although the paper was never published, scientists still recognize her contribution to mycological research today. Long before she was a published author, Beatrix Potter drew illustrations for some of her favorite stories, including Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Cinderella, as well as her sketches from nature. Her imaginative art led to the publication of her earliest works, greeting card design and illustrations for the publisher Hildesheimer and Faulkner. There followed more publications, including a series of frog illustrations and verses for Changing Pictures, a popular annual offered by the art publisher Ernest Nister, which cemented Beatrix's desire to publish her own illustrated stories. Potter first tasted success as an illustrator, selling some of her work to be used for greeting cards. The story was inspired by a pet rabbit Potter had as a child, which she named Peter Piper. Yes, there was a real Peter Rabbit. He was a Belgian buck rabbit named Peter Piper. He was actually the second rabbit that Potter kept as a pet. The first was Benjamin Bouncer, who was the inspiration for Benjamin Bunny. They were part of a menagerie of animals that Potter and her brother adopted as children, which also included birds, lizards, mice, snakes, snails, guinea pigs, bats, dogs and cats, and even hedgehogs. Potter was especially fond of Peter Piper and would take him on walks on a leash. She later described in a letter how he liked to lie in front of the fire like a cat. He was clever at learning tricks, and he used to jump through a hoop and ring a bell and play the tambourine. In one of her personal editions of Peter Rabbit, Potter wrote an inscription dedicated to poor old Peter Rabbit, who died on the 26th of January 1901, an affectionate companion and a quiet friend. Through the 1890s, Potter sent illustrated story letters to the children of her former governess, Annie Moore. The first Peter Rabbit story, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, was originally created in 1893 when Potter was 26 years of age, and she sent a letter to Noel Moore, the 5-year-old son of Potter's former governess, Annie Moore. The boy was ill, and Potter wrote him a picture and a story letter to help him pass the time and to cheer him up. The letter included sketches illustrating the narrative, and the letter was dated September 4th, 93.
My dear Noel, I don't know what to write to you, so I shall tell you a story about 4 little rabbits, whose names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They live with their mother in a sandbank under the roof of a big fir tree. Now, my dears, said old Mrs. Bunny, you may go into the field or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little rabbits, went down the lane to gather blackberries, but Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed underneath the gate. First he ate some lettuce and some broad beans, then some radishes, and then feeling rather sick he went to look for some parsley, but round the end of a cucumber frame whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened and rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he would have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught fast by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Mr. McGregor came up with a basket which he intended to pop over the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind, and this time he found the gate, slipped underneath, and ran home safely. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter was ill during the evening in consequence of overeating himself. His mother put him to bed and gave him a dose of chamomile tea, but Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. I am coming back to London next Thursday, so I hope I shall see you soon, and the new baby. I remain, dear Noel, yours affectionately, Beatrix Potter.
After Potter sent the Moore children, including Noel's siblings Nora and Eric, 2 more illustrated letters, one about a squirrel named Nutkin and another about a frog named Jeremy Fisher, the children's mother, Annie, suggested she turn them into children's books. In 1900, Moore, realizing the commercial potential of Potter's stories, suggested they be made into books. Potter embraced this suggestion and borrowed her complete correspondence, which had been carefully preserved by the Moore children, selected a letter written on the 4th of September, 1893, to 5-year-old Noel that featured a tale about a rabbit named Peter. Peter biographer Linda Lear explains, the original letter was too short to make a proper book, so Potter added some text and made new black and white illustrations and made it more suspenseful. These changes slowed the narrative down and added intrigue and gave a greater sense of the passage of time. Then she copied it out into a stiff covered exercise book and painted a colored front piece showing Mrs. Potter dosing Peter with chamomile tea. Potter's beautiful illustrations came from her interest in the natural world. As a child, she would draw and sketch animals around her with a sharp, observing eye. She could be quite ruthless about it. In fact, when a pet died, she would skin and boil its body so she could use the skeleton for anatomical sketches. She studied the plant world as well, producing over 300 paintings of mushrooms by 1901. All this practice and close observation led to her elegant style, where animals look real even though they're wearing top hats and petticoats. As Lear explains, Potter titled the tale of Peter Rabbit and Mr. McGregor's Garden and sent it to publishers, but her manuscript was returned, including from Frederick Warren and Company, who nearly a decade earlier had shown some interest in her artwork. Some publishers wanted a shorter book, others a longer one, but most wanted colored illustrations, which by 1900 were both popular and affordable. The several rejections were frustrating to Potter, who knew exactly how her book should look. She had adopted the format and style from Helen Bonham's Little Black Sambo, and how much it should cost. She decided to publish the book herself, and on the 16th of December, 1901, the first 250 copies of her privately printed The Tale of Peter Rabbit were ready for distribution to family and friends. So Potter reworked Peter Rabbit, doubling its length and adding 25 new illustrations. 6 publishers rejected the story in part because they didn't agree with Potter's vision for the work. She wanted the book to be small for children's hands, and the publisher wanted it to be larger and therefore more expensive. Potter refused, explaining that she would rather make 2 or 3 books costing 1 shilling each than one big book because little rabbits cannot afford to spend 6 shillings on one book and would never buy it. In December 1901, she self-published Peter Rabbit. The 250 copies sold out in a few months, and she ordered a reprint. Meanwhile, Potter continued to distribute her privately printed edition to family and friends, with the celebrated creator of Sherlock Holmes, author Conan Doyle, accompanied acquiring a copy for his children. When the first private printing of 250 copies was sold out, another 200 were prepared. She noted in an inscription in one copy that her beloved pet, Rabbit Peter, had died. To help Peter Rabbit get published, a friend rewrote it as a poem. While Potter was self-publishing, Canon Rawnsley, in 1901, as Lear explains, a Potter family friend and sometimes poet, rewrote the story in rhyming quintuplets in an attempt to get publishers interested again. His version began, "There were 4 little bunnies, no bunnies were sweeter, Mopsy and Cottontail, Flopsy and Peter." Rawnsley submitted his text with Potter's illustrations, along with Potter's illustrations and half her revised manuscript to Frederick Warren and Company, who had been among the original rejectors. Warren editors declined Rawlsley's version, but asked to see the complete Potter manuscript. Warren wanted color illustrations throughout the bunny book, as the firm referred to the tale and suggested cutting the illustrations from 42 to 32, and marked which ones might best be eliminated. Potter initially resisted the idea of color illustrations, but then realized her stubborn stance was a mistake. She sent Warren several color illustrations along with a copy of her privately printed edition, which Warren then handed to their eminent children's book illustrator, L. Leslie Brooke, for his professional opinion. Brooke was impressed with Potter's work. Fortuitously, his recommendation coincided with the sudden surge in the small picture book market. Their interest stimulated by the opportunity the Tale of Peter Rabbit offered the publisher to compete with the success of Helen Bannerman's wildly popular Little Black Sambo and other small-format children's books then on the market. When Warren inquired about the lack of color illustrations in the book, Potter replied that rabbit brown and green were not good subjects for coloration. They agreed to publish the book, but with one stipulation. They wanted to use Potter's simpler language. Potter arrived at an agreement with Warren for an initial commercial publication of 5,000 copies. Negotiations dragged on into the following year, but a contract was finally signed in June of 1902. Potter was closely involved in the publication of the commercial edition, redrawing when necessary, making minor adjustments to the prose, and correcting punctuation. The blocks for the illustrations and text were sent to printer Edmund Evans for engraving, and she made adjustments to the proofs when she received them. Lear writes that even before the publication of the tale in early October 1902, the first 8,000 copies were sold out. By the year's end, there were 28,000 copies of the Tale of Peter Rabbit in print. By the middle of 1903, there was a fifth edition sporting colored end papers. A sixth printing was produced within the month. And a year after the first commercial publication, there were 56,470 copies in print. Over the years, the Tale of Peter Rabbit has sold more than 40 million copies worldwide, and as of 2008, the Peter Rabbit series has sold more than 151 million copies in 35 languages. Now we're going to cover some of the basics of the stories that she wrote that involved Peter Rabbit. Peter Rabbit made his first appearance in 1902 in the Tale of Peter Rabbit. The story focuses on a family of anthropomorphic rabbits. The widowed mother rabbit cautions her young against entering the vegetable garden of a man named Mr. McGregor, telling them, "Your father had an accident there, and he was put in a pie by Miss McGregor." Her three daughters obediently refrain from entering the garden, going down the lane to pick blackberries, but her rebellious son Peter enters the garden to snack on some vegetables. Peter ends up eating more than is good for him and goes looking for parsley to cure his stomachache. Peter is spotted by Mr. McGregor and loses his jacket and shoes while trying to escape. He hides in a watering can in a shed, but then he has to run away again when Mr. McGregor finds him and ends up completely lost. After sneaking past a cat, Peter sees the gate where he entered the garden from a distance and heads for it. Despite being spotted and chased by Mr. McGregor again, with difficulty, he wriggles under the gate and escapes from the garden, but he spots his abandoned clothing being used to dress Mr. McGregor's scarecrow. After returning home, a sick Peter is sent to bed by his mother, while his well-behaved sisters receive a sumptuous dinner of milk and berries as opposed to Peter's supper of chamomile tea. In the tale of Benjamin Bunny, first published in 1904, Peter's cousin Benjamin Bunny brings him back to Mr. McGregor's garden, and they retrieve the clothes Peter lost in the tale of Peter Rabbit. But after they gather onions to give to Josephine, they are captured by Mr. McGregor's cat. Bouncer arrives and rescues them, but also reprimands Peter and Benjamin for going into the garden by whipping them with a switch. In this tale, Peter displays some trepidation about returning to the garden. In the tale of Flopsy's Bunnies, first published in 1909, Peter has a small role and appears only briefly. He has grown up, and his sister Flopsy is now married to their cousin Benjamin. The two are the parents of 6 little Flopsy bunnies. Peter and Josephine keep a nursery garden, and the bunnies come by asking him for a spare cabbage. In the tale of Mr. Todd, first published in 1912, Benjamin and Flopsy's children are kidnapped by the notorious badger Tommy Brock. Peter helps Benjamin chase after Brock, who hides out in the house of the fox, Mr. Todd. Mr. Todd finds Brock sleeping in his bed, and as the two get into a scuffle, Peter and Benjamin rescue the children. Peter makes cameo appearances in two other tales. In the tale of Miss Tiggy Winkle, first published in 1905, Peter and Benjamin are customers of Miss Tiggy Winkle, a hedgehog washerwoman. The two rabbits are depicted in one illustration peeping from the forest foliage. In the tale of Ginger and Pickles, first published in 1909, Peter and other characters from Potter's previous stories make cameo appearances in the artwork, patronizing the shop of Ginger and Pickles. To mark the 110th anniversary of the publication of The Tale of Peter Rabbit, Frederick Warne and Company commissioned British actress Emma Thompson to write the further tale of Peter Rabbit, in which Peter ends up in Scotland after accidentally hitching a ride on Mr. and Mrs. McGregor's wagon. The book was released on the 18th of September 2012. In autumn 2012, it was reported that Thompson would write more Peter Rabbit books. Her next tale, The Christmas Tale of Peter Rabbit, was released in 2013, followed by The Spectacular Tale of Peter Rabbit in 2014.
Once upon a time, there was a serious, well-behaved young black cat. It belonged to a kind old lady who assured me that no other cat could compare with Kitty.
Thus begins the newly discovered children's story by renowned British author Beatrix Potter. In 2016, Beatrix Potter fans received welcome news. A previously unpublished story, The Tale of Kitty and Boots, will be making its way to bookstore shelves that fall. An unedited manuscript for the work had been discovered by children's book editor Joe Hanks. Potter had only done one illustration for the book, so Quentin Blake, created the images to accompany this tale. Peter is said to be in the newly rediscovered book, The Tale of Kitty and Boots. According to the publisher, Peter is now older, full of himself, and has transformed into a rather portly buck rabbit. Now, Penguin Random House has announced the story, which was written over a century ago, will be published in September 2016 in conjunction with the celebrations being planned to celebrate the 150th year anniversary of Potter's birth. The Tale of Kitty and Boots tells the story of a cat who's leading a double life. Joe Hank, a publisher with Penguin Random House, discovered the 1914 manuscript 2 years ago after he came across a mention of it in an obscure literary history of Potter, which sent him to London's Victoria and Albert Museum and knee-deep into the Potter archives. It appears the author was intending to publish the story. She had written and revised it twice, and after rewriting it for a third time, she had it typeset. The author had even begun the process of laying out a proof dummy. The only thing left were the illustrations. Then life interrupted her. World War I started, a new marriage, and a new farming business among her distractions. Whatever the reason, she never completed the manuscript, which has been described as possibly her best work, filled with humor, rebellious characters, and even a couple of intriguing villains. Some old favorites also make an appearance. Peter Rabbit, of course, although older, and everyone's favorite hedgehog, Miss Tiggy Winkle. The author had completed just one drawing to accompany the story, so Quentin Blake, who provided the illustrations for Roald Dahl's books, had been selected to complete the illustrations for The Tale of Kitty and Boots. Merchandising for Peter Rabbit. Peter Rabbit was the first character to be fully merchandised, and it was Beatrix Potter's idea. In 1903, seeing the popularity of Peter Rabbit, she began to sew a doll version for Warren's niece, writing,
I am cutting out calico patterns of Peter. I have not got it right yet, but the expression is going to be lovely, especially the whiskers, pulled out of a brush.
She patented the doll, making Peter Rabbit the oldest licensed character. Potter was one of the first to be responsible for such merchandise. She also invented a Peter Rabbit board game for 2 players in 1904, a complex version of which was redesigned by Mary Warren and came to market 13 years later. In addition to toys and games, Beatrix published books including Peter Rabbit's Almanac and painting books for Peter Rabbit and Jemima Puddle Duck. She felt passionately that all merchandise should remain faithful to original book illustrations and be of the highest quality. The merchandising helped make Peter Rabbit into a popular icon and turn the world of Beatrix Potter into one of the biggest literature-based license organizations of its day. The character has been depicted in multiples of spin-offs merchandise such as porcelain figurines and dishes. Peter Rabbit has also appeared on the packaging of the infant formula Infamil. Frederick Warren and Company owns the trademark rights of the Beatrix Potter characters. However, most of the stories are in the U.S. public domain as they were published before 1923. Now the American copyright. Warren's New York office failed to register the copyright for the Tale of Peter Rabbit in the United States, and unlicensed copies of the book, from which Potter would receive no royalties, began to appear in the spring of 1903. There was nothing anyone could do to stop them. To her dismay, the firm failed to register copyright in the United States, leading to piracies and loss of revenue. Although she helped save the company in 1917 after embezzlement by another Warren brother nearly bankrupted, she scolded them on quality, condemning a copy of Peter Rabbit's Almanac for 1929 as
wretched.
She wrote sharply,
"It is impossible to explain balance and style to people if they don't see it themselves."
While she enthusiastically crafted her own unique merchandise prototypes, including an extraordinarily soulful Peter Rabbit doll, she could have no idea of the extent of commodification to come. The enormous financial loss to Potter only became evident over time, but the necessity of protecting her intellectual property hit home after the successful 1903 publication of The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, when her father returned from Burlington Arcade in Mayfair at Christmas 1903 with a toy squirrel labeled Nutkin. Potter asserted that her tales would one day be nursery classics, and part of the longevity of her books comes from strategy. She was the first to exploit the commercial possibilities of her characters and tales. Between 1903 and 1905, these included the stuffed toy, an unpublished board game, and a nursery wallpaper. Considerable variations to the original format and versions of the Tales of Peter Rabbit, as well as spin-off merchandise, have been made available over the decades. Variant versions include pop-ups, Toys Theaters, and Lift the Flat books. By 1998, modern technology had made available videos, audio cassettes, a CD-ROMs, a computer program, and internet sites. As described by Margaret McKay, writing in the case of Peter Rabbit, Changing Conditions of Literature for Children, she continues, Warren and their collaborators and competitors have produced a large collection of activity books and a monthly educational magazine. A plethora of other Peter Rabbit-related merchandise exists, and toy shops in the United States and Britain have whole sections of the stores specifically signposted and near-marked exclusively for Potter-related toys and merchandise. Unauthorized copying of the Tale of Peter Rabbit has flourished over the decades, including products only loosely associated with the original. In 1916, American Lewis A. Field cashed in on the popularity by writing books such as Peter Rabbit Goes to School and Peter Rabbit and His Ma, the illustrations of which showed him in a distinctive blue jacket. In an animated movie by Golden Films, The New Adventures of Peter Rabbit, Peter is given buck teeth, an American accent, and a fourth sister, Hopsy. Another video, retelling of the tale, casts Peter as a Christian preacher singing songs about God and Jesus. The Peter Rabbit, rather than other Beatrix Potter characters, the Peter Rabbit stories and merchandise are very popular in Japan. Many Japanese visit the Lake District after becoming familiar with Potter's works at an early age at school. There is an accurate replica of Potter's house and a theme park in Japan, and a series of McGregor's gardens in one of the largest banks. Merchandisers in Japan estimate that 80% of the population have heard of Peter Rabbit. In 2016, Peter Rabbit and other Potter characters appeared on a small number of collectors' 50p UK coins. Movie adaptations. In 1938, shortly after the success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt Disney became interested in making an animated film based on the tale of Peter Rabbit. Potter refused. Some accounts say that this is because she wanted to remain in control of the rights to her work. Others suggest that she didn't think her drawings were good enough for large-scale animation, which she thought would reveal all their imperfections. However, most likely, Beatrix Potter refused to give up the rights to Disney because of marketing issues. In 1935, the story was loosely adapted to the Merry Melodies short film Country Boy. It shows some modifications in relation to Beatrix Potter's original story. Most notably, the Rabbit family surname is changed to Cottontail, and Peter having 2 brothers and a sister rather than 3 sisters. In 1971, Peter Rabbit appeared as a character in the ballet film The Tales of Beatrix Potter. In late 1991, HBO aired an animated musical adaptation of The Tale of Peter Rabbit, narrated by Carol Burnett as part of the network's Storybook Musicals series, which was later released to VHS by Family Home Entertainment under HBO license. Several of the stories featuring Peter Rabbit were also animated for the 1992 BBC anthology series The World of Peter Rabbit and Friends, and 2 edutainment titles published by Mindscape, The Adventures of Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny in 1995, and Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit's Math Garden in 1996, both of which have since been released on VHS and DVD. In 2006, Peter Rabbit was heavily referenced in a biopic about Beatrix Potter entitled Miss Potter. In December 2012, a new CGI animated children's TV series titled Peter Rabbit premiered on Nickelodeon, with a full series run beginning in February 2013. Peter was voiced by Colin DePaula throughout Season 1 and recanted by L. Parker Lucas for Season 2 in the US version. In the UK version, he was voiced by Connor Fitzgerald. Also in 2012, Quantum Theatre Production produced a new stage adaptation of The Tales of Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny. Written by Michael Whitmore, the play toured the UK until 2005. More recently, John Patrick is adopting a number of Beatrix Potter tales into an upcoming live animation action music festival musical feature film for his brand new film studio called Storybook Studio. The film will be titled Beatrix Potter's The Tale of Peter Rabbit and Friends. One of the stories adapted for the film is The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Peter will be voiced by children's actress Sienna Adams. John Patrick has released a preview clip of the film on YouTube. An animated live-action adaptation, Peter Rabbit, produced by Sony Pictures Animation, is scheduled to be released on the 9th of February 2018. James Corden will voice Peter Rabbit, and Rose Byrne will star in the live-action role of the lead female named Bay. Other cast members include Margaret Robbie, Daisy Ridley, and Elizabeth Debicki. Will Glunk is directing and producing the film, and Zarin Nalbandian is also producing, while Lauren Abrams is overseeing the project for Sony Pictures Animation. Peter Rabbit's feud with Mr. McGregor reaches new heights as both compete for the affection of the kind animal lover who lives next door. Cast is Dromhall Gleeson as Mr. Thomas McGregor, a farmer and exterminator who seeks to be rid of Peter Rabbit and his mischievous acts. Rose Byrne as Bay, a kind animal lover who Thomas meets next door. Sam Neill as Old Farmer McGregor. The film, again, is scheduled to be released on February 9th, 2018. Now, Beatrix Potter and the Lake District. When Peter Rabbit came out, Potter was 36 years old. She worked closely with her editor, Norman Warren, on it and several other books. The two became very close, and in July 1905, Warren proposed marriage, even though Potter's parents objected to his social position. They didn't want their upper-class daughter to marry a man who worked in a trade. Still, Potter accepted his proposal. 1 month later, Warren fell sick and died of a blood disorder that was probably undiagnosed leukemia. She bought Hilltop Farm in the Lake District that same year and there she wrote the books as the Tale of Tom Kitten and The Tale of Samuel Whiskers, 1907 and 1908. Beatrix loved the Lake District and became her solace after the death of her beloved Norman. Afterward, Potter remained unmarried for many years. Income from her books enabled her to invest in farmland, including Hilltop Farm, which would become a feature in many of her tales. And as she invested in the Lake District, she developed a relationship with William Hillis, a local solicitor who assisted her property dealings. William proposed to Beatrix in 1912, and they were married in London the following year. Her family objected to him too. She only produced a few more books after tying the knot. Potter published The Fairy Caravan in 1926, but only in the United States. She thought the book was too autobiographical to be released in England. The Tale of the Little Pig Robinson, 1930, proved to be her final children's book. They lived together at Castle Cottage in their beloved Lake District until her death in 1943. Beatrix was a staunch supporter of the National Trust, having been impressed on meeting its founder, Hardwick Rawnsley, from her first visit to the Lake District at 16. She followed its principles in preserving her buildings and farms in keeping with the rural culture of the area, and she saved many farms from developers. Instead of writing, Potter focused much of her attention on her farms and land preservation in the Lake District. She was a successful breeder of sheep and well regarded for her work to protect the beautiful countryside she adored. During her lifetime, Beatrix bought 15 farms and took a very active part in caring for them. Dressed in clogs, shawl, and old tweed skirt, she helped with the haymaking, wading through the mud to unblock drains, and searched the fells for lost sheep. Beatrix bred Hardwick sheep on her farm in the Lake District, and said she was at her happiest when she was with her farm animals. She won a number of prizes for her sheep at local shows and became the first elected female president of the Hardwick Sheep Breeders Association in 1943. Potter died on December 22, 1943, in Surrey, England. In her will, she left much of the land holdings to the National Trust to protect it from development and to preserve it for future generations, leaving 15 farms and over 4,000 acres of land to the National Trust. In accordance with her wishes, Hilltop Farm was kept exactly as it had been when she lived in it and received thousands of visitors every year. Potter has also left behind a mystery. She had written a journal in code. The code was finally cracked and the work published in 1966 as the Journal of Beatrix Potter. To this day, generation after generation are won over by her charming tales and illustrations. After Potter died in 1943 at the age of 77, Warren cast itself as the guardian of her legacy, but eventually the Guardians began behaving badly, seeking to wring profits from its most famous long-eared property. In 1983, Warren was acquired by Penguin, itself owned by the international conglomerate Pearson, the largest book publisher in the world. Then, as scholar Margaret McKay chronicles in The Case of Peter Rabbit, Changing Conditions of Literature for Children, Warren embarked on the expensive process of remaking printing plates for Potter's books. While the new reproductions were a welcome improvement, Warren festooned them with what Mackey terms aggressive assertions of copyright, although Peter was already in the public domain. In the UK, copyright protections lapsed, but were then extended until 2013 when European Union harmonized copyright law. Warren seized on its originated illustrations to declare itself owner of all rights, copyrights, and trademarks in the Beatrix Potter character names and illustrations, going so far as to attach a TM to the scampering Peter on the cover. Back in 1979, the publisher had sued a competitor, claiming trademark rights to 8 images from Potter's books that it argued were identified in the public mind with Warren alone. The case was settled out of court, but Viva R. Moffat, a legal scholar who teaches at the University of Denver, has called Warren's claim in a paper on mutant copyrights a stretch. Warren has applied for trademarks in the U.S. and the EU for every imaginable Peter Rabbit-related item that might feasibly be sold, from books and text in all media to toilet seat covers and meat extracts. Moffat assails the practice of forcing trademarks to pinch hit for lapsed copyrights, while other legal experts, Jason Mazzone, who teaches intellectual property law at Brooklyn Law School, defines the placement of misleading warnings on public domain works as copy fraud in his book by the same name. Warren's zealous pursuits of its rights has not deterred it from crass acts of its own. In 1987, the same year it published its painstakingly remade edition, the firm allowed Ladybird Books, a purveyor of cheap paperbacks owned by the parent company Pearson, to market the Tales of Peter Rabbit with text that eliminated Potter's dry wit, dispensing with the pie made of Potter's father. Miss Rabbit instead explains that Mr. McGregor just doesn't like rabbits, and replaced Potter's illustrations with photos of stuffed animals. Warren was condemned in the Times of London, saying that the new edition was Hamlet without the ghost, or Othello without the handkerchief. Undaunted, a few years later, Warren took out an advertisement in the bookseller Peter Rabbit packs a powerful punch, threatening those who wandered into its garden with expensive legal action. One last question. Why do so many Japanese tourists visit Potter's Lakeland College? According to the man from the Cumbria Tourist Board interviewed on Radio 5, it is because Japanese children use her books to learn English. I love the idea of a nation mislearning another through such a distorted lens. If you would like to email me, reach out at hareoftherabbit@gmail.com, or you can visit the website at hareoftherabbit.com. If you would like to support the podcast and keep the lights on, you can support us whenever you use Amazon through the link at the website on the Support the Podcast page. This will not cost you anything extra, and I cannot see who purchased what. You can also become a Fluffle fan supporter by donating through Patreon. And again, there's a link at the hareoftherabbitpodcast.com.